welcome to Views on News. I am Jawad Tehami. In the recent weeks, we have seen rising tensions in an already strained relationship between the US and China. This relationship turned worsened rather after the US shot down a Chinese balloon that flew in its airspace, accusing China of using it for the spying purposes, which was categorically denied by China, saying that it was a weather balloon. And then US accusation on China contemplating providing lethal assistance to Russia in the Ukraine conflict exacerbated the situation further. China denied this and rather urged the US to go for the political settlement of the Ukraine conflict rather than adding fuel to fire. At the same time, China also released a position paper regarding the Ukraine conflict, urging for the ceasefire and the talks between the conflicting sides of this particular crisis. Now, most recently, Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang has blamed the US for the rising tensions between the US and China. Let me quote him what he said: "If the US doesn't hit the brake and continues to speed down the wrong path, no amount of guardrails can prevent the derailment, which will become conflict and confrontation, and who will bear the catastrophic consequences." He went on to say that US suppression and containment is a provocation that cannot be tolerated indefinitely. Similar sort of statements were made by Chinese President Xi Jinping, also saying, let me quote him also, that China must have the courage to fight as the country faces profound and complex challenges in both domestic and international landscape, unquote. We'll try to understand where this particular Sino-US relationship stands at this particular point in history, where it is heading, and these sort of statements, very strong-worded statements coming from the Foreign Minister of China, what do these statements depict, and how our analysts will be bringing in just in a moment think that these sort of statements would be received as far as the US is concerned. We are honored to have been joined in the studio by Mr. Air Marshal retired Farhat Hussain. He's President, Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Mr. Farhat, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And on Skype from Potsdam, Germany, we are being joined by Mr. Harley Schlanger. He is political analyst associated with the Schiller Institute. Mr. Schlanger, thank you very much for your time also, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Now, let me begin the discussion with you, Mr. Farhat. Now, these sort of statements, as one that I've quoted already, let's specifically talk about this one when Chinese Foreign Minister says that the US suppression and containment is a provocation that cannot be tolerated indefinitely. Quite a stern warning, isn't it?
Yeah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. This is a very strong statement coming from the Chinese side, which has usually proposed 5 principles of coexistence to the United States. This needs to be seen in the background. And if you give me 2 minutes, I'll try to explain.
Please go ahead.
The China-US rivalry. How has it started and where is it? We don't want to go too far back, but 90s, if you look at 90s, the Chinese have been growing at a very fast rate in economic terms and technologies. Since then, the US has been talking, the term at that time used was curtailment of China. Containment of China. So, containment for China was a proper terminology being used in think tanks and the United States and etc. And the countries around that, around China, were being triggered.
At that very much time, during the 90s.
Yeah, but that is not at a very strong pace. Yes, it was being, because China was feared by the United States as a future superpower. Whereas the Chinese always said, we are a growing economy, we are not a superpower. So, they always downplayed it and they always looked inward. So, 3 areas of competition started. One is the economy, second is technology, third is the military. Right? The military, without any doubt, the United States is far ahead of China. Economy, the Chinese are going fast and they are supposed to be, as per the predictions, crossing over the US GDP another 7, 8, let's say about 30, 30, 30, 28, 30. Okay. So, and third is the, you know the G5 war. So in out of these three, US has a clear edge in one area and they're lagging far behind in the other two areas. So both the countries had picked up this. Yeah, that's how the competition kept going. Then came the time when the Russia, the terrorism broadly. During the terrorism, China didn't do much, but the US was busy this side. Till Obama came and he decided to withdraw from Afghanistan in 2014, all that plans. When they got relief from there, the world was thinking that the Cold War is over, now we'll get a sign of relief and live peacefully. But unfortunately, it was not to happen. In 2011, Obama announced now an active competition with China through Indo-Pacific strategy, which clearly says, a document clearly says, it is meant for dominance. They do not like China to domain this region or the world. So that is how the background has been going on. It has been intensifying. US has been intensifying in the military terms. Chinese have not competed with them in the military term, although they've been challenging them in some, but they've never this is the first time he's talking about stern actions, and that's the change. That's one. The Indo-Pacific strategy is a very important document. It has effects on Pakistan, it has effects on the region. They have formulated that strategy, and an alliance strategy is going on in the region in the Indo-Pacific. There's AUKUS, Australia, UK, United States. Then there's Quad dialogue between 4 countries. All Quad here, India, US, Japan, and Australia. So all this is happening where? In one region that is around China. So it's a build up to press China, but they're not able to do that. So coming back to this shooting of the drone. Now, if you recall, I think the Chinese clearly said, look, it was a weather, and then we never intended anything. But the response from the US side was aggressive. They used F-22s to shoot down this balloon. It was an overkill situation. And then after some time, they owned it also, it was not a spy balloon. So that means the shooting incident was not warranted, it was created. So that is how the scenario is. At this time, a Ukraine war is another element that is affecting.
I'll come to that point later in the show. Let me bring in Mr. Schlanger into the discussion also. Mr. Schlanger, how stern do you think these warnings by the Chinese foreign minister for the US are?
Well, I think the Chinese foreign minister took a step beyond what China had been doing. China has been very measured in its response to the US literally war talk against China. I mean, the reality is that the United States feels threatened by the rise of China as an economic nation. Why does that threaten the United States? Well, there's a geopolitical view, that the US and its NATO allies are the only ones that can dictate the terms of trade, international investment policy, and so on, which is really the shift from the old British Empire to a new Anglo-American NATO empire, with NATO military to enforce it. And the previous speaker mentioned these agreements, the Quad, the AUKUS, and you can add to that the Japan-UK agreement that was just recently reached, which is a military agreement surrounding China with military. Now, the important question here is, why are they so frightened? And I think you go back to February 4th of last year, the Russia-China talks, where they signed a series of agreements, economic, diplomatic, and military. But they basically said, we will defend jointly our sovereignty and the sovereignty of nations from the global south. And what we're seeing is, it's not just China. The US is fearful. What they just saw at the G20 summit, where the non-G7 nations that are part of the group of 20 refused to go along with the United States to condemn Russia. There's growing trade agreements. there's growing military agreements. And so there was a report put out by the RAND Corporation, one of the most important think tanks in the United States. This just came out in January, and what they said is, we'd better end the Ukraine war quickly so we can concentrate on China. So the mentality of the administration, the Biden administration, but also the Republicans, is that China is a threat. And so we're seeing these various provocations, the warning about arms to Russia, the absurd spy balloon incident. Don't forget, they just put out a new report saying that China is the source of the COVID from the Wuhan Institute. And then you have the chip war. So there's an all-out offensive coming from the United States. And the Chinese are finally saying, look, you'd better back off because this is going to go in a direction you don't want to take it. And the other reason for that is that U.S. military people are saying clearly, the U.S. is not prepared to fight a two-front war. That China has the upper hand strategically when it comes to Asia. And so that's why the U.S. is trying to pull together all these treaty agreements, new bases in the Philippines, and so on, for fear that if they go to war with China, the U.S. does not have a good platform from which to fight.
Right, Mr. Schlanger. Let me quote another a statement by Mr. Chen Gang when he says, we will take it as our mission to defend China's interest, and we firmly oppose any form of hegemonism and power politics. We firmly oppose the Cold War mentality, camp-based confrontation, and acts to contain and hold back other countries' development. We will resolutely safeguard China's sovereignty, security, and development interests. Do you see any sort of shift in the policy if we analyze this particular statement coming now from the Chinese foreign minister?
Are you asking me?
Mr. Schlanger, yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, okay. Well, what the Chinese are doing is they're proceeding with their plans for the Belt and Road Initiative. They're making agreements not only in Africa and Asia, but also in South America. And what the Chinese have done is outflank the United States. The United States does what? It backs the International Monetary Fund. It backs austerity. It backs looting of raw materials of countries. The Chinese have come in with plans for building infrastructure, rail, dams, energy projects, and so on. So China has an attractive package. Now, at the Schiller Institute, we've proposed for years that the interest of the United States would be best served by working with China to develop these countries. But instead, the U.S. in both parties is committed to this unipolar order in which the flow of wealth goes from the poorer countries to the richer. And any country that tries to object to that is subject to military attack. And the Chinese are going to stand and defend not only their sovereignty, but the sovereignty of the other nations that the U.S. is targeting. And that's why countries like Nigeria, Algeria, Brazil, Mexico, Indonesia are all orienting now towards China and Russia, away from the British and the United States and NATO.
Right. Mr. Farhat, do you see a shift in that diplomatic demeanor or the face of China when it comes to giving such type of stern statements as Mr. Chen Gang has said that we are not going to tolerate that hegemonism and that camp politics sort of a scenario?
Yeah, I think this statement is very significant. This would increase the tension in many areas in the world. Of course, with this year economically also there are a lot of economic difficulties world over. So the economies are going to face the major brunt because of these alliance policy, geopolitics, and other things. Economic war between US and China would affect many countries and therefore the geopolitics. Like a colleague is saying, the United States has started a policy of alliances and trying to push countries to adopt a stance against China. Ukraine, any like he just said, G20. Otherwise also, look at Pakistan, whatever. So they're pushing this. That means they're really feeling the heat of the economic development of which is going to overtake the American interests. So therefore, this is actually a war of hegemony. The Chinese have now, having developed enough significantly, in my view, although we still don't have a very concrete conclusion on this, it is the first statement that you have. Subsequently, we will know they will probably launch a diplomatic offensive also on this front.
Right, your point is well taken. We are honored to have been joined on the phone line by Mr. Syed Hasan Javed. He's a former ambassador. Mr. Javed, thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. Where do you see the Sino-US relationship at this particular point in history, and where do you see, what's your understanding after the kind of developments and the kind of strong worded statement, the exchange of it, where this particular relationship is headed to?
Well, thanks. You have asked my opinion on this. The US-China relations are going through a rough patch at this moment. As you know, this has a long history, of course, but after the normalization of relations, you know, there were three communiques that United States and China had signed that formed the basis of the full normalization. These three communiques were referred to as Shanghai Communique, and which recognized one China, and whatever now you are seeing is a reversal of some of the agreements that United States had clearly made under those communiques to recognize the one China policy. And what you see now is that the United States now feels that China is becoming a strategic competitor, and they have made no secret of that, and they are trying to, again, like in the Cold War, first Cold War, I mean the Cold War from 1947 to 1991, you saw United States forming coalitions against the Soviet Union, and so it's a very tragic. It's a very you can say a moment of very serious concern for the international community that Cold War, which actually inflicted environmental and all sorts of damages to the international community, now they want to replay, and that is very sad, because the world does not deserve this, because now what we see is that the international community expected an era of peace and prosperity, and the United States actually after the 1980s was in the forefront of promoting this globalization. But now you see decoupling, talk of decoupling, and talk of coalition building, Quad, for instance, as your worthy guests were pointing, and steps to contain China. But the international community doesn't see a point in containing China. Why for China should be contained? China is not. China is playing a very positive role for international peace, development, and has been making all efforts to make its contribution to lessen conflicts all over the world. So why should China be contained? In fact, if at all, China's influence as success, as you see in the Belt and Road Initiative, the China has been, the 140 nations have actually approved of this and become, active partners in the Belt and Road Initiative. So if the United States cannot keep up its economy and competition with the China, that the fault doesn't lie with China, and the United States needs to actually take a introspective view of its problems, instead of becoming desperate and instead of adopting a policy that is not likely to bring any good to the United States or the international community. So I see the evolution of these relations now going through a rough patch, really rough patch, especially with respect to Taiwan. All the undertakings that the United States made, now they are doing reversing that. That is not good for the region. And also what you see is a militarization and nuclearization of the Pacific region, and particularly the role that you see, spoilers role being played by some of the regional countries like India is the source of concern that where is this going to all lead to?
Mr. Syed Hasan Javed, former ambassador, thank you very much for joining us at Views on News tonight on the phone line. We really appreciate your time. Now, Mr. Farhat, as Mr. Hasan Javed has pointed a very important thing over here, that the kind of policies or the kind of containment, the suppression the U.S. is up to as far as China is concerned, it is neither going to serve the U.S. its own interests, also neither of the international community. Your take?
Yes, I agree with him. China, by design, does not seem to have any offensive. They have not even developed too much in terms of offensive capability. They truly believe in the principles of coexistence. Look at them. India, as part of Quad and other agreements with the United States, is being pitched with China. And on the other hand, Chinese are increasing trade with them. In the recent few years, it has gone to 100 billion plus. So that means they basically believe in peaceful coexistence. United States, if you recall, Mr. Trump few days back was saying every president has picked up a war every time, every tenure, except Mr. Trump. So they are by design show of military and dominance. They are by design in the field of dominance. Chinese by design are in the field of peaceful coexistence. That's the basic difference. So therefore, this is the war that is going on. And let's see, I think the military dominance will also, when the military dominance of the United States goes down, which look at NATO, look, the entire NATO and the United States supporting Ukraine, and Ukraine is not going to achieve its objective, and Russia has not went down. Russia has not lost much. So therefore, the war goes on. The Chinese have given first time some bit of offensive statement, but I don't think they'll go beyond that in the military terms, but they certainly are likely to go beyond that in the political and diplomatic terms.
Right. Mr. Schlanger, the Chinese foreign minister has also said when we talk about China's relationship with Russia, let me quote, that the relationship between Beijing and Moscow was going from strength to strength. Now, already we saw the U.S. Secretary of State, Mr. Antony Blinken, accusing China of contemplating or providing the lethal assistance to Russia in the Ukraine conflict, which was categorically denied by China. Of course, they also released a position paper on the Ukraine conflict, urging for the ceasefire as well as the talks between the conflicting sides. Now, this particular thing, how the U.S. should be urged regarding this particular statement, and do you think there might be a sort of a realization among the U.S. authorities that it were their policies that have pushed China and Russia ever closer?
Well, I think a China-Russia alliance was in the works before the most recent Ukraine crisis, because they're natural allies, because the Chinese are looking at the raw material wealth of Russia, and the Russians are looking at the economic growth of China as a model. In contrast to that, the U.S., as I said, is a country that makes its profits through looting, through unfair trade negotiations, through the weaponization of the dollar, and so on. So the alliance between Russia and China was something that was bound to happen at some point. Now, your point is absolutely right. The targeting of Russia, the way the U.S. did it with sanctions, with arms to Ukraine, the Chinese obviously see that, and they see the same thing being done toward Taiwan. the buildup of a crisis in Taiwan as an excuse for war. Now, it's worth noting there are two leading U.S. military officials, Minahan, who's the head of the Air Force Logistics, and Stanley Richard, an admiral who's the head of the Southern Pacific Command. Both have said there will be war between the United States and China. Minahan said by 2025, Richard by 2027. Now, these are fairly important military people, but there are other people in the military who say, look, we can't even win a war with NATO on our side in Ukraine against Russia. How are we going to fight a two-front war? So I think what the previous speaker said is true. The U.S. military is in a bad position right now. NATO has run out of weapons. They've provided their stockpiles to Ukraine, and they're not winning that fight. They're not going to win in Ukraine. So the question that the Chinese intervened with this 12-point peace plan was an excellent strategic maneuver, because much of the world is supporting that, calling for negotiations, for recognition of sovereignty, for no Cold War mentality. So I think the Chinese have the upper hand in what Lavrov is now calling the global majority, not the global south, but the global majority. Will the U.S. adjust its posture? Well, I think it's going to have to, because we're seeing peace movement growing in Europe. In Germany, where I live, there were 50,000 people who marched against the war in Berlin a week and a half ago. It's growing in the United States. That's the big hope, that the American population will turn against the war hawks who currently control U.S. policy and are pushing to contain China even to the point of war.
Right, Mr. Schlanger, when it comes to Taiwan, the Chinese foreign minister says that it is the core of the core issues and the first red line that must not be crossed in the US-China relations. So if the provocation from the US continues to happen in future as well, what possible options do you think would be remaining at the hands of the Chinese?
I think it's pretty clear militarily that the Chinese hold the upper hand. The U.S. can send arms into Taiwan, they can do other things, but don't forget there were recently regional elections in Taiwan where the anti-independence party won. That is, the governing party, which has been leaning toward independence from China, got smashed in the elections. So this is not a winning proposition, but the problem is if you keep sending ships through the Straits of Taiwan, if you keep sending weapons, the Chinese will respond, not militarily. They don't have to respond militarily, but by flexing their muscles and showing the actual weakness of the United States. So I am hopeful there won't be a confrontation. The problem is that I think there are people in the United States and in the military-industrial complex, so-called, who need war. Remember, the U.S. defense budget is now over $813 billion. China just had a big increase, and it's only $230 billion. So the question here is, where's all that U.S. money going? It's not winning the war in Ukraine. So I think some sensible people in the United States realize that these wars are not in the interest of the United States. The question is who's going to get that across to Biden? Because Biden right now is captive of the war party in the United States.
Right. Mr. Farhat, what's your take regarding this particular thing? What possible options do you think Chinese would have if such sort of provocation happens in future as well on the front of the Taiwan issue?
Yeah, I think irrespective of what happens, the rivalry or competition that you call it is not likely to get into the stage of direct confrontation, military confrontation. Reason being that will have serious implications on the world politics when the two major powers get into that. So I think that China is going to stay short of that, and neither will the United States go to the level.
So
that
what
they
does
have
this particular statement beg your pardon for the interruption, if they are not going to go head on in a direct conflict, what does this statement by Chinese president depict? That China must have the courage to fight as the country faces profound and complex challenges in both domestic and international landscape.
I agree with you, that's a tough statement, but it will have, if they go beyond that into a direct military confrontation, it will have far serious consequences for the world peace and the world order. That is what I am saying. They will have to think 20 times both of them to go. Yes, this is a war of politics. They will continue to move on their own strengths. They'll continue to influence the world politically, and then the China would move on, and in my view, the China would try and move on the technological and try and beat the United States in technology. And the US will continue, US will continue to do this card of military. And I think on the overall analysis, if you look maybe 10 years, 12 years down, US is going down, the China is rising up. So Chinese do know what they are doing. They sometimes gives this statement, but they know their strength lies in the economy, not in the military.
Right. Mr. Schlanger, your quick take regarding this statement by President Xi Jinping that China must have the courage to fight as the country faces profound and complex challenges in both domestic and international landscape.
Well, I think Xi Jinping's policy is that China's great strength is economic and technology, and they're going to continue to go in that direction. At the same time, conducting diplomacy, which is oriented toward peaceful development, the idea of a community of shared interests. And you contrast that to the US hegemony policy, and I think Xi Jinping has the winning hand. The only problem, as Lyndon LaRouche once said, never underestimate the factor of insanity in American strategic policies. So that's a real threat that we have to watch out for.
Right, Mr. Harley Schlanger, political analyst associated with Schiller Institute, joining us on Skype from Germany. Thank you very much for your time, for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. In the studio, we were joined by Air Marshal retired Farhat Hussain, President, Center for Aerospace and Security Studies. Mr. Farhat, thank you very much for your time, also for being with us on Views on News tonight. We really appreciate that. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Till the next one, take good care.
Thank you.